Welcome to Work Comp Talk, a podcast dedicated to all of the injured workers here in the state of California. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. That way you get notified every time I create new content. And if you've been following us for some time now, thank you so much for the support. If you know someone who can benefit from these amazing conversations, make sure you hit that share button and also let them in on these secrets that we are discovering with the California Workers' Comp system. My name is Carmen, your host, and joining me today is my co-host, Bilal Kassem. Bilal, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking, Carmen. How are you doing?
I'm doing amazing. Super excited because today's topic I know is going to hit home to a lot of people that have been in this situation and to a lot of people that have all these questions in regards to where is my check? What the hell's going on with the payment system? Where's my check? How come I didn't receive my payment? So without further ado, let's jump into why are some of the reasons that people can get a delayed check? You know, let's say that someone is just recently injured, their claim is accepted, everything rolled through seamlessly, and all of a sudden, there's no check in the mail. You know, what's usually going on? Can you explain that for us a little bit?
I think it depends really on what kind of check we're talking about in the first place, right? When people receive checks in workers' comp, we're really talking about two different types of benefits. There's temporary disability, which is designed as a wage replacement that you're supposed to get while you're off of work and you're still recovering from your injury. And there's also permanent disability advances, which are benefits that are supposed to pay you for the functional limitations that you have once your injury has medically plateaued. And those are really two different types of benefits. I think the most common interruption we see with payments to clients has to do with temporary disability, and that's the check that you get while you're off work recovering. And really, to get temporary disability, you need to have a work status report from your doctor. And that's something you're supposed to get every 45 days as they continue to certify you for ongoing work restrictions or to keep you off of work entirely. And probably the biggest reason benefits are cut are usually there's an interruption with a work status report being delivered to an employer, meaning either the client doesn't go to their doctor within a certain amount of time, and so the insurance company doesn't have an up-to-date report to continue paying temporary disability, or there's some miscommunication or no communication between, the doctor, the injured worker, and the employer and or the insurance company. And so that really boils down to a communication more than anything else. If the insurance company is not receiving up-to-date work status reports to certify your condition and your work restrictions, that creates difficulty for them to determine whether or not they still need to pay you. So that's a really common occurrence we see. Other times we see occurrences where the insurance company just stops paying for whatever reason.
Is this due because of the claim adjuster not being your friend, not being a nice person?
Sometimes
do they have control over it?
Sometimes they'll misinterpret a medical report, or sometimes, they'll say they never actually received an updated work status report or medical report, despite, there being email or fax confirmations that exist. They don't just see it in their file for some reason. That happens on occasion too. We also see people who hit their cap. You're only allowed up to 104 weeks of temporary disability within a 5-year period following your date of injury at work. So, there are exceptions to that. HIV, high velocity eye injuries, amputations, those extend your temporary disability up to 240 weeks within 5 years. But for the most part, most people have an injury that falls within that 104 week, in which case, if you hit that cap, then your benefits are going to be cut off.
Yikes. I mean, I would hope that the people that do have those types of injuries, they would get the extension of this amount of payment. But obviously, it goes back to it's important to go to your doctor's appointments and keep up with all of this stuff, right? Who do you call? Like, let's say, I don't know, your wage replacement check stopped coming in. Like, as an injured worker, where do I even begin to start calling to get a hold of this?
Yeah, the first person you're going to want to call is you're going to want to call the adjuster. Obviously, if you're missing your check, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were the ones that actually cut you off. Checks get mailed out still. There are some insurance companies that will offer direct deposit as an option to injured workers, in which case the deposit's directly to your account. You don't have to worry about checking your mailbox and going to the bank and actually depositing, a physical check. But, if you are one that's receiving checks then you want to check with the adjuster to see, hey, did you guys actually send out my check? Or did it get stolen, or is it lost in the mail? That
Right.
happens a lot. Sometimes there's delays, sometimes mail is delivered to the wrong address, or just sometimes it's stolen or, misplaced, whatever the case may be. So you want to make sure that, one, the adjuster did actually issue the check. And if they say they did and they have proof of that, then obviously it's not something that the adjuster messed up, or there's no communication issue, there's no missing reports or anything like that. It's as simple as, hey, my check's missing, it hasn't been delivered, maybe it's a week or two late. At this point, do I want to continue waiting, or do I want to ask the adjuster to stop payment on the check if it hasn't already been cashed, to ensure that, the check is basically cut off and they can reissue a new one to you to make up for that lost or missing check. So that's probably step one. If they didn't issue the check, because they had a reason for it, obviously you want to talk to them about what that reason is. Maybe it's something that's really easily fixable. Hey, we didn't get your last work status report. Okay, well, you have the work status report. You say, great, adjuster, I'll send it to you right now. Make sure you get that. I don't know why you didn't, but let's make sure you have it. And then let's continue my temporary disability. In which case, if there's been no legal changes, no medical changes, it's just the same continuing work restrictions that can't be accommodated or something, or, an ongoing order for total temporary disability, meaning off work completely, and you haven't hit your cap yet, then that should be enough for the adjuster to just continue to say, hey, I got the work status report, let me issue the payment, and we're good. So the adjuster is really the primary point of communication that's going to be able to help you determine where something is going wrong and why you aren't receiving your check.
Okay, will it ever be a case where you're going to get bounced around, where the claim adjuster is not telling you the truth and essentially blaming the doctor, and then the doctor tells you it's the claim adjuster? Like, worst case scenario?
It shouldn't be. I mean, when payment is stopped, you're supposed to get a notice, right? The adjuster isn't supposed to just cut off your checks and not explain why. Usually they're required to send you some sort of notice in the mail explaining why you're not receiving your checks. Like, we haven't received an updated work status report, so we're delaying payment, or, you've hit your 104-week cap, so we're going to be cutting you off. Usually there's some form of notice that goes along with the missing check. When you stop getting payments and you haven't received anything in the mail explaining why, that's usually a pretty big red flag that there's something going on there that you should be looking into,
Yeah. So you answered the next question I was going to ask you, which was, can they essentially just stop paying you? That's one of the biggest questions that freaks people out, when the insurance just flat out just stops paying you with no warning. So now that you've told me this, obviously there is a warning ahead of it actually happening.
They're supposed to be, right? It doesn't mean in practice that's always the case. We deal with a lot of cases, and a lot of times people are cut off arbitrarily or accidentally, maybe even intentionally, without, real significant legal justification for it. In which case, there are penalties and sanctions available to injured workers for, bad faith, frivolous conduct that, the insurance company engages in. But when you're talking about the value of the sanction, and the penalty that the insurance company is dealt, in the case they mess up, it's not that significant relative to how late payments or non-payments impact an injured worker's life.
Yeah. I mean, bills don't wait, right? And life goes on. So imagine not having that payment as an injured worker because the claim adjuster, I don't know, delayed something for whatever reason. They believe that you're no longer eligible for benefits. Let's say, we've talked about this a lot too in other episodes, where, there is some sort of surveillance happening and you get caught doing things, or they're trying to twist things. And is that significant reason enough for them to just be like, hey, you're no longer qualified?
No, I mean, let's say they catch you on surveillance doing something that they think is outside the scope of your work restrictions or beyond what the doctor said you can do. That in and of itself is not significant enough to warrant terminating your benefits. They need a medical opinion that there is a change in work restrictions or a change in your medical condition or your ability to work that would then trigger a change in the benefits. But that comes from the doctor. That's not a decision the adjuster gets to make.
Good to know.
The adjuster can potentially cut off benefits in advance of a medical opinion, but they would be, significantly risking sanctions big time. They can't arbitrarily choose to cut benefits when and if they feel like it. But again, the issue is if you're living off temporary disability, trying to just make do paying your rent, taking care of kids and stuff like that, and the adjuster cuts a check or two, that significantly impacts your life. Maybe you
100%.
get evicted. For them, if they eat, a $200 penalty, it's a multi-billion-dollar insurance company. They don't care. It's the punishment is not proportionate to the crime,
Yeah.
for them, unfortunately.
So what can you do as an injured worker to protect yourself? Say someone's worried about their check being stopped. Is there anything that the injured worker can do ahead of it before it gets stopped?
Sort of. I mean, it's important to plan ahead, in terms of just the time limits. If you're already at 95 weeks of temporary disability, you should be thinking about the fact that in, 9 weeks, that your temporary disability is going to be cut off, regardless of whether you're better or not. And you need to plan ahead for that so that you're not in a position where you're not receiving benefits and don't have an alternative plan moving forward. A lot of people start to apply for state disability, for example. That way, there's kind of a seamless transition from when they're actually receiving temporary disability to when they actually go on the state benefit.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll actually plan to, hate to say this, but kind of prematurely go back to work, even if they're not feeling like they really can, because they don't have really any other financial options available to them. So it's important to think about it ahead of time. As far as receiving the benefit and ensuring that your check's not going to stop, it's always important to make sure that work status reports are constantly provided to the employer, to the insurance company, that if there are any changes in your work status, meaning your work restrictions or your ability to work in general, that you want to make sure you're in constant communication with the employer to determine if they can actually bring you back to work. Another very big instance where we see people kind of getting messed up is, they won't communicate with their employer. And the doctor will say, okay, well, instead of only working 2 hours a day, now you can work 6 hours a day. Or, instead of only being able to lift 20 pounds, now I'm going to move you up to being able to lift 40 pounds. And maybe that's a work restriction or hour limitation that the employer can accommodate, in which case the employer may offer the injured worker modified work. And if the injured worker declines it, their benefits are going to be cut off and they can potentially be let go from their employment. And then, of course, they're without any financial compensation at that point. So, it's really important to stay in communication, stay on top of the reports, and stay on top of the doctor appointments.
Yeah, definitely. Again, I'm assuming keeping all medical appointments on hand. And is it valid for you to get the medical report from the doctor, the status report, every time you go to your appointment? Are you entitled to a copy of it so that if it doesn't get sent to the adjuster, you can kind of just snap a picture of it, send it automatically? Is that a thing?
Yeah, and most physicians will actually give the injured worker a copy of the work status report when they leave their medical appointment. They might not always get a copy of the request for authorization for medical treatment or the summary of the medical report of that appointment itself, but usually they will get a work status report from their physician.
Okay, that's good to know. So what happens if you hit a wall? You've done everything, you went to your appointments, and the check just doesn't seem to come. What options would you suggest an injured worker do then?
Assuming that you're actually entitled to the benefit and you're not, there's no legal or medical issue there, and the insurance company's still not paying you, you need to go to court to get the judge to order them to pay you, in which case you'd be asking for, late penalties. You'd potentially be asking for sanctions because, inappropriate conduct. And ultimately, you'd ask for a court order to issue the check that you're owed.
Yeah. Okay. So that's where you would get an attorney, of course. Like, it's not something that you can it's not a walk in the park type of thing that you can just kind of figure it out on your own.
It depends on your resources. You have to know how to get a court date in the first place. And then when you get to court, you'd need to know, what the type of hearing is that you're actually wanting to go to enforce the benefit. And then once you're actually in court, you'd need to know how to present the evidence that would substantiate what you're asking for.
Yeah. Okay. So now that I'm thinking about, okay, there's a delay in my checks. What happens if there's a significant delay, right? And then all of a sudden they start paying you again, but the gap between the time you were not getting paid wasn't allocated to the check you received once it restarted. Is that a thing? Does that happen?
Sometimes, on occasion, we'll have someone who is getting pretty regular checks for temporary disability, and then their payments will stop. There's some issue for some reason. The maybe the insurance was claiming they didn't get updated work status reports, and let's say there's maybe like a 6 to 8 week gap or something like that in between payments. Sometimes the adjuster will backdate the payment and pay it kind of like a lump sum, and then keep them going forward as if it was continuing on that 2 week schedule. Other times the adjuster will just say, okay, well, we're going to start payment again as of, the 6 or 8 week later date, in which case that 6 to 8 week period you want receiving payments doesn't count towards your 104-week cap or 240-week cap, depending on your injury. So that does happen. And depending on how it's paid, either retroactively or a continuing payment, and depending on how much you care about how it's structured, it can be implemented differently.
Yeah. How long is too long to wait for that check? Like, would you say act on it as of 2 weeks, or, because it's like, I can imagine people at home injured, not getting paid, and they're like, well, maybe it's coming this week. Maybe it's coming this week. Like, how long is too long to keep waiting for that check before you take action?
I mean, they're supposed to be issued on a regular schedule. You're supposed to get payment issued every 14 days. So, fine. Maybe there's a day or two interruption here or there because of mail or staffing situation, holidays, things like that. But for the most part, you should be on a pretty clear track going forward about, the frequency and the times which you receive payment. So, honestly, anything more than like 3 or 4 days, that should kind of, that should get your attention,
Yeah, for sure.
And then, certainly 5+ days, week later, you should be calling the adjuster to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, it makes total sense. So that's like one of the biggest questions asked, right? Where is my check within the workers' compensation system? Is there anything that we haven't touched on in regards to this question that you'd like to share, Bilal?
Yeah, just in terms of the difference between temporary disability and permanent disability, temporary disability can be cut off for a variety of reasons. You hit the cap, you've hit the max, your work restrictions changed, or your employer decides that they can accommodate your work restrictions and offer you modified work. There's also permanent disability advances, which are checks the injured workers get while they're potentially still in their case, but either their temporary disability has stopped because they've maxed out for some other reason, or they've actually reached what we call MMI status, which is maximum medical improvement. Once you've reached maximum medical improvement for all the body parts in the case, then you may start getting permanent disability advances. And the advances that you receive for permanent disability throughout the case are significantly lower in most cases than temporary disability because of limits. But also, the amount you get is just an estimate, right? The insurance company is obligated to advance a reasonable amount of the permanent disability that you have based on the medical reports, which is, reasonable estimate is sometimes up for debate depending on how significant, the ratings are and how much one party disagrees with the medical examiner's findings. So you can have a case where, maybe the adjuster estimates that your permanent disability is like 20%, which is around probably 20 grand and change in terms of the benefit. And they start advancing that while you're off of work recovering. Now, they may only say, we're going to advance 15,000 of the 20,000. And is that considered reasonable? I don't know. It'd ultimately be up to a judge to determine whether they had a good faith basis to believe that advancing only 15,000 of the $20,000 benefit was reasonable at the time of the case. And they may actually cut off your benefits despite you having maybe a higher rating, at least on paper, than what the insurance company is paying you for. So sometimes that would be a cutoff as well. But the cutoff in permanent disability is largely just based on the permanent disability rating that you have given usually by your primary treating physician or the QME in a case.
Right. Okay. So that obviously is a completely different story, right? And it kind of goes into a different route for you to kind of fix that issue. Like, how would someone fix that issue if your permanent disability check stops? Obviously, it's not due to the reasons we explained for temporary disability benefits or wage replacement. How would someone, what would those steps be for someone to fix that issue with the permanent disability checks?
I mean, that's a bigger, more complex issue because at that point, you're really trying to fight over whether or not the ratings provided by, the QME are accurate, or if you have a QME and a PTP who both provided ratings for your body parts, whether, those are accurate, who's got the more, appropriate rating. You need to know how to actually, we call it string rating, which means not only taking the doctor's rating, but also applying your age, your occupation, and the body part injured is a formula to determine how much your disability is actually worth. And sometimes, different occupational variants, there's these codes that we use to basically either increase or decrease the value of the disability rating by the doctor. Sometimes the defense uses one that lowers the rating, whereas we use one that increases the rating. So there can be a whole lot of, complex math and justification for either raising or lowering the rating and what's actually reasonable, and that's something you would really need to have an understanding of how injuries are rated and how the laws applied to permanent disability to determine whether or not, you should be filing a hearing because, they shouldn't be advancing you disability at all. They should still be paying you temporary disability because maybe only one body part was MMI, not all the body parts.
Yikes.
Or if they've just really undercut the value of your disability and given you a significantly lower advance than you think is reasonable based on the reports we have. But that would, again, be really digging into nuanced medical legal issues and, again, bringing that to the court's attention and fighting it out in court.
I mean, overall, it just sounds so stressful. And this is just one topic based off of so many other things that could potentially go wrong in the workers' comp system. And I can just imagine as as an injured worker, you're trying to deal with recovering. Maybe you're also dealing with, pain. And then to think about all these issues that can arise within the system, it's a lot to take on. So to wrap this up, I definitely think that, keeping up with the doctor visits, the status reports, calling the adjuster first when things are not going into plan how they should be, not being afraid to escalate if necessary. If you feel stuck, if getting that help obviously is going to move the needle for you. And I'm excited that we were able to touch the subject because it's a really frequently asked question within the California workers' comp system, and not getting paid is a big setback for many people and many families. You've said it yourself, people lose their house, they get evicted, and it's scary, at the end of the day, it's changing people's lives for sure. So I wanted to thank you so much for breaking this down, Bilal. And I hope that, if anyone gets anything from this, is don't give up. Like, don't just let it be and just be like, okay, well, I'm not getting paid anymore. That's it. So, okay, they said no, and let that be the end of it, right? So again, Bilal, thank you so much for this time.
Of course.
And if you're listening, if today's episode helped you, of course, make sure you subscribe to Work On Talk once again. Hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so that you can get notified when we upload a new content. And don't forget to visit the sponsors, Pacific Workers, the Lawyers for Injured Workers. If you're in this pickle and you need help, then you can definitely reach out to the team. Bilal has really, really done an amazing job creating this entire law firm to help injured workers, and you can check them out at pacificworkers.com. I will also leave it linked on the description below and also provide the phone number. If you'd rather just go ahead and call in, you can text, obviously with the team as well, and let them know if you're at work and you don't want to be on the phone. We can also do it via text, and you can get a free consultation. It doesn't cost you anything besides a couple of minutes of your time just to get your options going, trying to figure out which way you're going to move next. So we'll catch you guys on the next episode of Work Comp Talk, and thank you for watching.